San Francisco broke me. It did not break me in a sudden collision of fate and misfortune. It broke me slowly, meticulously, grinding away at the foundation of my life until there was nothing left but dust and echoes. My name is Gary Ostrowski. I am 68 years old now, but when I was 65, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and left the only world I had ever known. I moved to Vietnam, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I finally began to live. Hi. I was an electrician in the Mission District of San Francisco for 32 years. I belonged to the union. I worked hard. I wired homes, office buildings, and restaurants. I knew the guts of the city. I knew its currents and its sparks. I felt its pulse through the copper wires I handled every day. For a long time, I believed that because I helped build the city, because I kept its lights on, the city would always have a place for me. I was wrong. The city does not care who wires its lights. It only cares who can afford to pay for them. The fog rolling over the hills used to feel like a comforting blanket, a cool embrace that told me I was home. But in those final years, the fog felt like a shroud, obscuring a city that had turned its back on me. The damp chill seeped into my bones, carrying with it the bitter realization that my time there was drawing to a devastating close. The streets I had walked for decades, the corners where I had shared jokes with fellow tradesmen, all of it felt alien. The familiar landmarks remained, but their soul had been surgically removed, replaced by a cold, calculating efficiency that valued capital over community, profit over people, and wealth over humanity. Every morning, I would wake up in my apartment, brew a cheap cup of coffee, and look out the window at a skyline that was rapidly changing, bristling with cranes building luxury towers that I would never set foot in, let alone live in. The city was growing, reaching higher and higher into the sky, but it was leaving me behind in the shadows below. I was an artifact, a relic of an era when a man could work with his hands and earn enough to live a decent, honorable life. That era was dead, and its corpse had been paved over to make way for the new aristocracy. Over 32 years, I watched the gentrification of San Francisco unfold like a slow-moving disaster. The Mission District, once a working-class haven filled with families, corner stores, and the scent of fresh bread, transformed into a playground for the wealthy. Silicon Valley wealth poured over the hills, washing away everything that made the city human. Tech billionaires and startup millionaires bought up the Victorian homes, painted them sterile gray, and flipped them for obscene sums. The corner bakeries were replaced by artisanal coffee shops, where a single cup cost more than what I used to earn in an hour. My neighbors, people I had known for decades, were evicted, priced out, exiled from the only home they had ever known. Gentrification is not just about rising rents. It is an exile. It is the systemic erasure of the working class. It is being told, day after day, that you no longer belong in the place you built. I watched my city become unrecognizable, a glittering fortress of wealth where I was merely a ghost, haunting the streets I used to call home. I remember the exact moment I realized the Mission District was lost to us. It was a Tuesday evening, and the old hardware store where I used to buy my tools, the one owned by the Martinez family for 3 generations, had closed its doors forever. A month later, the building reopened as a boutique selling organic, sustainably sourced dog food and artisanal pet accessories. It was a slap in the face, a visceral demonstration of the shifting priorities of the neighborhood. The people who needed affordable hammers and nails were gone, replaced by people who could afford to spend a small fortune on their pets. The demographic shift was relentless and unforgiving. The vibrant murals that once told the stories of struggle and triumph of the working class community were now just colorful backdrops for tourists taking photographs for their social media profiles. The culture had been commodified, stripped of its original meaning, and sold as an aesthetic experience to the highest bidder. We, the people who had created that culture, who had lived those struggles, were now just inconveniences, obstacles to be removed in the name of progress and property values. Gentrification did not just change the demographics. It changed the very air we breathed, making it toxic with anxiety and the constant gnawing fear of displacement. The breaking point came in the form of a single devastating piece of paper. It was my rent receipt for my last month in San Francisco, $3,200 for a one-bedroom apartment. $3,200. It was a sum that felt like a physical blow. I stared at the numbers, the crisp ink on the paper mocking my lifetime of hard work. How could a man work for over 3 decades, contribute to his community, play by the rules, and still be unable to afford a roof over his head? The answer, of course, was that the rules had changed, and nobody had bothered to tell me. My income was a union pension of $800 plus Social Security of $1,000, a total of $1,800 a month. In any other era, in many other places, that would be a respectable sum, enough to live a quiet, dignified retirement. But in San Francisco, it was worthless. It was a cruel joke. I was drowning, and the city was watching me sink with cold indifference. Holding that rent receipt, that small rectangle of paper demanding $3,200, was like holding a death sentence for my way of life. The numbers were grotesque. They represented more money than my father had made in a year during my childhood. And for what? For a modest one-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and plumbing that constantly needed repair. The sheer audacity of the demand was staggering. It was a clear, unambiguous message from the city. You are not wealthy enough to exist here. Your contributions, your history, your 32 years of honest labor, wiring the very buildings that these new elites now occupy, none of it matters. The only metric of human worth in the new San Francisco was capital. If you did not have it, you were discarded, swept away like debris on the sidewalk. I felt a profound sense of betrayal, a deep, aching wound in my soul. I had kept my end of the social contract. I had worked hard, paid my taxes, joined the union, and been a good neighbor. But the city had torn up the contract and rewritten the rules while I wasn't looking. The sheer injustice of it all was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. My personal life was also fraying under the strain. My wife, Janet, and I had been married for many years, but the constant pressure of surviving in the city had taken its toll. We grew apart, the stress eroding our bond until there was nothing left but a tired, polite distance. We decided to separate. It was amicable, friendly even, but it meant I was now facing the brutal arithmetic of San Francisco alone. Janet moved into a smaller place, struggling in her own way, while our son, Kevin, lived across the bay in Oakland, fighting his own battles against the rising tide of costs. The math simply made no sense anymore. Every month I watched my meager savings dwindle, swallowed by rent, groceries, and utility bills. I was sliding toward poverty, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was a proud man, a working man, and the thought of relying on charity or becoming a burden to my son was unbearable. I needed a way out. I needed a miracle. The slow dissolution of my marriage to Janet was a quiet tragedy, a casualty of the invisible war being waged against the working class in the city. We didn't fight much in the end. We were too exhausted for screaming matches. The stress of simply existing in an environment so hostile to our survival had drained us of our vital energy. Every conversation about the future ended in the same terrifying cul-de-sac of financial despair. How do we survive this? We didn't know. The uncertainty poisoned everything, creeping into the cracks of our relationship and slowly prying us apart. We separated not out of a lack of love, but out of a desperate need to survive individually in a landscape that made surviving together impossible. Janet found a small studio, taking on a second part-time job just to keep her head above water. Kevin, our son, was out in Oakland, struggling with his own exorbitant rent, working long hours just to maintain a precarious foothold in the Bay Area. We were a family fractured by the economic reality of our time, each of us fighting a lonely battle against an insurmountable opponent. The loneliness of that period was absolute. I was surrounded by millions of people, yet I had never felt so utterly, completely alone in my entire life. It was during one of my darkest moments, scrolling aimlessly through the internet late at night, that I discovered Vietnam. More specifically, I stumbled upon articles and videos about expatriates living comfortably, beautifully even, in Southeast Asia on modest pensions. It seemed impossible at first, a fantasy peddled to desperate people, but the more I researched, the more real it became. I read about Hoi An, an ancient town in central Vietnam, a place of yellow walled buildings, glowing silk lanterns, and a strong sense of community. The picture showed a town that looked like it had been lifted from a dream, a stark contrast to the concrete and glass of the new San Francisco. Around this time, I read a book that profoundly shifted my perspective. It was called You Were Never Meant to Stay by Alan Walker. The central thesis of the book struck a chord deep within me. It argued that clinging to a place that no longer serves you, a place that actively pushes you away, is a form of self-destruction. Walker wrote that true home is not necessarily where you were born or where you spent your working life, but where you can live with dignity and peace. You Were Never Meant to Stay by Alan Walker became my manifesto. I read it over and over, letting its words wash away the guilt I felt about abandoning my city. If you want to read it, the link is in the comments. It gave me the courage to accept that my exile from San Francisco was not a personal failure, but a structural reality. I was being pushed out, yes, but I could choose where I landed. Discovering the possibility of a new life in Vietnam was like finding a hidden door in a room where I had been trapped for years. The algorithm of the internet, usually a source of mind-numbing distraction, suddenly became a lifeline. I watched videos of expatriates walking through bustling markets, buying fresh produce for pennies, living in beautiful, spacious apartments that cost a fraction of my San Francisco rent. The contrast was dizzying and felt like I was looking into an alternate universe where the rules of economics were actually designed to allow human beings to thrive, rather than merely survive. I spent hours, then days, then weeks, consuming every piece of information I could find about Hoi An. I studied the climate, the culture, the visa requirements, the cost of health care, and then I found the book, You Were Never Meant to Stay by Alan Walker. That book was the key that unlocked the final door in my mind. It dismantled the powerful mythology that ties our identity to our geographic location. It taught me that loyalty to a city that is actively destroying you is not a virtue, it is a tragedy. The book provided the intellectual and emotional framework I needed to execute my escape plan without feeling like a coward. When I told Janet about my plan to move to Vietnam, I expected resistance, perhaps even pity. Instead, I received her surprising support. She understood. She had seen the toll the city had taken on me, the way it had ground down my spirit. We sat in a coffee shop in the Mission, one of the few remaining places that had not been entirely sanitized, and she held my hands. "You have to go, Gary," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "You cannot survive here anymore. None of us can." Her blessing lifted a massive weight from my shoulders. It affirmed my decision and allowed me to leave without the heavy burden of unresolved guilt. And so, at the age of 65, I boarded a plane and flew across the Pacific, leaving behind the only life I had ever known. Janet's reaction was a testament to the depth of our shared experience and the profound understanding that only comes from decades of partnership. She looked at me across that small coffee shop table, her eyes reflecting the same exhaustion that I felt in my bones. She didn't try to talk me out of it. She didn't ask how I could leave her or our son behind. She simply recognized the necessity of the move. It was a matter of survival. Her blessing was the final push I needed. It removed the emotional shackles that tied me to the Bay Area. The process of packing up my life was surreal. 32 years of accumulation, of memories, of physical objects, all distilled down into 2 suitcases. I sold my furniture, gave away my books, and donated most of my clothes. Every item I parted with felt like shedding a layer of skin. I was stripping myself down to the essentials, preparing for a rebirth in a place I had never even visited. The day I went to the airport, the fog was thick, obscuring the Golden Gate Bridge. It was a fitting farewell. The city I loved was hiding from me, just as it had hidden its true nature from me for all those years. I walked onto the plane, took my seat, and did not look back. My arrival in Hoi An was a sensory explosion. The heat, the humidity, the smell of street food, the endless sea of motorbikes. It was chaotic, beautiful, and utterly overwhelming. But beneath the chaos, I sensed a rhythm, a pulse of a life that felt surprisingly familiar. I found a local agent who showed me apartments. And then came the moment that truly changed everything. I was sitting in a bright, fully furnished apartment with large windows overlooking a quiet street, negotiating the lease. The landlord handed me the contract. The rent was $220 a month. $220. For a beautiful furnished home. I signed the paper, and when the landlord left, I sat on the floor of my new apartment and started laughing. I laughed until tears streamed down my face. It was the laughter of immense relief, the sound of a man who had narrowly escaped a slow, suffocating death. The anchor of that San Francisco rent receipt, $3,200, had finally been cut loose. I was free. The sensory overload of my first days in Hoi An was exactly what I needed to snap me out of the deep depression I had been sinking into in California. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, roasting pork, and the salty breeze from the nearby sea. The streets were a chaotic ballet of bicycles, motorbikes, and pedestrians, all moving with a synchronized grace that baffled me at first. But beneath the noise, there was a profound sense of peace. The people were warm, welcoming, and endlessly patient. With my fumbling attempts to communicate. When I signed that lease for $220 a month, the absurdity of my previous life crystallized perfectly. I was paying less for an entire month in a beautiful foreign country than I was paying for 2 days in a cramped apartment in San Francisco. The laughter that overtook me on the floor of my new home was the laughter of a man who has finally woken up from a terrible nightmare, the burden of constant financial terror, the paralyzing fear of homelessness, the crushing weight of systemic inequality. All of it vanished in that single moment. I was safe, I was secure, and I had done it on my own terms. Hoi An is a true neighborhood. It is the kind of community that San Francisco used to be before the wealth washed it away. It has walking streets where the air is not choked with exhaust fumes, where people actually stop and talk to each other. The ancient town, with its centuries-old architecture and glowing lanterns, feels like a living, breathing entity. I walk through the market every morning, buying fresh vegetables and fruit from vendors who now know my name and greet me with bright smiles. The financial breakdown of my life in Vietnam is almost comical compared to San Francisco. My rent is $220. My electricity bill is roughly $30. I eat out almost every day, enjoying incredible bowls of pho and banh mi, and my total food budget rarely exceeds $300 a month. With my income of $1,800, I am not just surviving, I am thriving. I have enough money to travel, to save, and to help others when I can. The complete financial breakdown that terrified me in California has been replaced by a deep, enduring sense of security. The rhythm of daily life here in the ancient town is incredibly restorative. I wake up early before the sun gets too hot and walk through the narrow, yellow-walled streets. The architecture is a beautiful